When we think about the Civil War, we usually imagine young soldiers charging across the battlefield. But in 1913, they weren't young anymore. They were gray-haired grandfathers. The war that had redefined America was now in the history books. But for the survivors, life didn't stop when the war ended. These men spent the next 50 years rebuilding their lives. Then, one day they heard about the reunion, the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. But there was just one catch. The enemy was invited. Despite that, 55,000 veterans made plans to return to Gettysburg. Approximately 3 million soldiers fought in the Civil War, but by 1913, only about 500,000 of them were still alive. Of that number, approximately 10% attended the Grand Reunion. That means, of course, that not every living veteran of the war went to Gettysburg, and not every veteran was ready to make peace. They say that time heals all wounds, and maybe that's true. But for some of them, 50 years wasn't long enough. And honestly, who can blame them? Imagine being invited to a party, knowing that a group of the guests had once tried to kill you. Would you go? Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. Neither answer is necessarily wrong, because reconciliation isn't something that can be accomplished by a group. Now, I sometimes make fun of the speeches given in the Great Tent, where men stood before thousands of veterans and talked about national healing and reconciliation. But if we're being honest, that's a bunch of phooey. Reconciliation is an individual thing. You can't force someone else to forgive. It's a deeply personal thing, and some of these veterans simply weren't ready for it. And perhaps they may never be. I've read accounts of veterans who never got over their hatred for the other side. Remember, 90% of the surviving Civil War veterans stayed home. Sure, some may have been too ill to travel, others couldn't afford the journey, but some undoubtedly carried emotional scars that 50 years had failed to heal. But the veterans who could put all of that aside and survive the heat and the crowds and the occasional disorganization of the event, they had the time of their lives. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why the reunion worked so well. Nobody was forced to attend. Every man who came made the decision for himself. And for some of them, nothing, not even old age, failing health, or objections of their families, was going to keep them away. The New York Tribune shared the story of Jacob J. Blake. He was an elderly Confederate living with his family up in Milford, Connecticut. During the war, Blake served under Confederate General A.P. Hill. At Gettysburg, he fought on all 3 days of the battle before being wounded. As an old man, Blake eagerly anticipated the reunion and spent months planning his trip. But his physician strongly advised against it. His health was poor, and the journey might actually kill him. Reluctantly, Blake agreed to stay home. Then he read in the newspaper that Sergeant James Russell of the Massachusetts Infantry would be attending the reunion. And immediately, Blake changed his mind. He was going to Gettysburg regardless of the risk. You see, Blake and Russell had served as pickets on opposite sides during the Battle of Gettysburg. For 3 days, they fired at one another. But when darkness fell and the shooting stopped, they met between the lines. They traded food and shared tobacco, and over those 3 days, one man in blue and one man in gray became friends. Jacob Blake later said that he would die happy if he could only see his old friend James Russell one last time. But sometimes the relationship between these veterans was a lot more complicated. Now let me tell you the story of J.T. Threaves and Daniel Koch. J.T. Threaves had served in Pickett's Brigade. Daniel Koch was from Pennsylvania and served in the famous Iron Brigade. They had been friends and classmates at West Point, one from the north and one from the south. During a holiday, Threaves brought Koch home with him to Virginia. While there, Koch fell in love with Threaves' sister and wanted to marry her. Then in the spring of 1861, everything changed. One afternoon, Threaves entered Koch's room carrying a newspaper. Fort Sumter had been fired upon, and the country was torn in two. The two friends didn't need to say much. They looked at the headlines, shook hands, packed their belongings, and went their separate ways. One to fight for Virginia, and the other for the Union. 3 years later, they met again. This time, they were on opposite sides at Gettysburg. One stormed the ridge, and the other defended it. Near the end of the war, Koch was captured and was taken to a field hospital in Virginia. When he awoke, he found himself being cared for by the very woman he had once pledged to marry. the sister of the man he had gone to war against. She nursed him back to health. But after the war, the couple went their separate ways and never saw each other again. Then, 50 years later, the two old soldiers returned to Gettysburg for the 1913 reunion and found each other again. That night, they sat beneath the stars and talked about the past, of all the joys and the sorrows, and when the night grew late, they walked back across the battlefield together, arm in arm. 50 years earlier, they had left West Point as friends and gone to war as enemies. Now, they were old men who had found their way back to one another. But not every veteran who came to Gettysburg was so fortunate. There's another side of the reunion that is both beautiful and kind of heartbreaking. Naturally, many veterans search for the survivors of their old regiments. After all, these are men they had marched with, perhaps shared a tent with, and fought besides on the battle line. During the war, their companies had numbered in the hundreds. Now, there was only a handful left. One veteran finally located a survivor from his regiment, but he found only one man. "Where are the others?" he asked. The answer was tragic. "It's just me. I'm the only one." Imagine what that must have felt like to realize that the men who had shared the defining moments of your youth were almost all gone. "This will be my last visit to Gettysburg," said Gus M. Adams, an aged veteran from Pasadena, California, who had made the trip. He was being led across the battlefield by his wife. You see, Adams had lost his sight about 12 years earlier, and although he could no longer see his comrades, he said he could still feel the love through the simple act of shaking hands with them. He said, "I was against the Gray in July of 1863, but now, in July of 1913, I am with them, body and soul." While traveling to the battlefield, Adam experienced another remarkable reunion. He heard someone call out, "Is there any member here of the old Company H of the 1st Ohio Light Artillery?" Adams answered, "Yes, here is one." And at those words, a man named Frank Record, who was Adams' close friend during the war, stepped forward and they shook hands. Adams later said simply, "And then I thank God." They were the only survivors of their old regiment. One by one, an entire generation was disappearing. But that's perhaps why the reunion mattered so much. Even if your own regiment had nearly vanished, there were still nearly 55,000 men who understood. Nobody needed to explain what it felt like to sleep in the rain or march until your feet bled, or lose friends whose names you had spoken every day until suddenly you weren't speaking them anymore. They could laugh about stories no one else understood. They could remember comrades and their families through letters that they'd never even met. And as the campfires died down and the night wore on, they could sit together in silence without needing to explain a single thing. For one remarkable week, they had found each other again. But eventually, the reunion came to an end and the train slowly carried the veterans back home. Many of them undoubtedly understood that they would never meet again. Not because they didn't want to, but because time had finally caught up with them. The Gettysburg reunion wasn't simply about remembering the Civil War. It was about remembering who they once were. Young, strong, and surrounded by their friends. For just a few precious days, they stepped back into that world. And then, just as quickly, slipped away again. There's a quiet sadness in growing old and watching the people who shape your life slowly fade away. But perhaps there's also comfort in knowing that for one remarkable week, in July of 1913, 55,000 veterans found each other one last time. And for those few days, they weren't forgotten old men. They were soldiers again. Thanks for watching.